Thank you, Honorable Member. It has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read a second time and committed. A bill for an act to amend the Central Bank of the Bahamas Act. As many, the chair recognizes the Honorable Member for Marco City.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Once again, I'd like to thank Almighty God and the people of Marco City for giving me an opportunity once again to make my voice available to stand in their defense and also to help them realize their dreams and aspirations, Madam Speaker. Today, we are looking, Madam Speaker, at the amendment to the Central Bank Act. Madam Speaker, we would not be here today debating this amendment had it not been for the fact that the Prime Minister and his colleagues made a decision to draw down on $232 million, to be a little bit more precise, $232.8 million of special drawing rights, even though they had no lawful authority, Madam Speaker, to do so. The Davis administration, Madam Speaker, is engaging in a pattern of behavior that is potentially detrimental to the long-term financial management of our national economy. This is evident, Madam Speaker, as I would come to in several respects. We are having this debate today because they have once again, Madam Speaker, broken the law. And once again, they are seeking to not only cover up their misappropriation of public funds, but they are trying to make their illegal acts legal today. They are, furthermore, trying to get the opposition to become complicit in their wrongdoing and subsequent attempt to exonerate themselves. Madam Speaker, there's a simple definition in Bahamian law as it relates to what is considered misappropriation of funds. Among the definition is the one that says committing government to a debt, to a liability that is not supported by the law. Madam Speaker, the very fact that we are here today is the government's own admission. In fact, the memorandum of understanding tabled by the Prime Minister himself is Exhibit A of his participation in his capacity as Minister of Finance in an illegal act. He is seeking to amend a law to allow him to do what the government has already done, drawn down on $232.8 million. That is why the document before you, the amendment, says that it is retroactive to the period where the illegal act was carried out, drawing down on $232.8 million. So when the Prime Minister seeks to be cute and disparaging by talking about pressing a button, the reality is that the Prime Minister knows very well that what was done was improper. Hence, for the last several months, Madam Speaker, your team has gotten notice that we would debate this amendment. And each time we came closer to debating this amendment, the government changed its mind, deferred it, and adjusted the amendment it first provided to the House. They knew that something was afoul. Let me amend that. The House members knew something was afoul. The Prime Minister knew from the very beginning, which is precisely why the very memorandum of understanding that you have in front of you lays out the case that this government was not authorized to draw down and utilize the special drawing rights. Madam Speaker, I wrote the Prime Minister, and let me just say, just for the record, Madam Speaker, during the course of this brief presentation, I intend to refer to the very guidance notes that the Prime Minister mentioned, which I'm confident he did not read in its entirety. Secondly, Madam Speaker, and let me amend that to say he did not read the sections relative to this liability. In addition, Madam Speaker, I would refer to the very memorandum of understanding that the Prime Minister laid before us. I wrote the Prime Minister, Madam Speaker, and the Governor of the Central Bank the end of last year. In fact, the end of December. The Governor, Madam Speaker, and the Prime Minister responded. The Prime Minister said then some of what he is saying now, that this is not, I repeat, that this is not a loan. In other words, this is not a liability. Well, Madam Speaker, that is patently untrue, and the Prime Minister knows it. So I'd like to take you through, Madam Speaker, several pieces of legislation and documents made available to us. I want to use the Prime Minister's documents. Issued pursuant to the Central Bank of the Bahamas Act 2020. For value received, the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas hereby promises to pay to the Central Bank of the Bahamas special drawing rights, SDRs, $178.4 million by December 1st, 2023. Let me repeat. The government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas hereby promises to pay to the Central Bank of the Bahamas special drawing rights, SDRs, $178.4 million by December 1st, 2023, together with interest at the SDR rates as determined by the IMF. As notified by the Central Bank, interest shall be payable at such frequency and on such dates as may be set by the IMF. This sounds eerily like a liability. No, I didn't say loan, but people would easily use the terms interchangeably. It's a liability. Let me continue. All or any part of the sum of STR 178.4 million shall be paid by credit of the amount to either BSD, Bahamian dollar, or BSD account, and long number, on the account, long number, of the Central Bank of the Bahamas. If payment of part of the said sum shall be made, a new note is substantially the same form of this note for the sum remaining unpaid hereon. Let me just simplify it. The bottom line is the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, through the Central Bank, Madam Speaker, sought to take possession of funds it needed for whatever purposes. The funds, Madam Speaker, were a part of the assets of the Central Bank, contrary to what the Prime Minister says. What he says doesn't matter. It's what the document said. Therefore, the Prime Minister and his colleagues through the Ministry of Finance had to enter into a formal arrangement with the Central Bank to take possession of funds that were a part of the Central Bank's asset. Madam Speaker, that is precisely why, when the Central Bank released its report, that we discovered, Madam Speaker, that there was a liability that this government had incurred to the Central Bank for funds they had taken possession of. Now, here's what's interesting about that. One, the government in July released its debt management plan and strategy. It never indicated any intention to borrow or add a liability in terms of funds it would take from the central bank. So this was a complete surprise to the population. This is the government that talks about transparency. How do you not indicate that you are about to draw down on 232 million, 0.8 million special drawing rights, which translate into the 178 million? How do you not tell the population you have intentions to draw down on this fund? You just released a report indicating your liabilities, your intended liabilities, the debts you would incur. Why did you not indicate this particular thing? It's clear it's not free money. I just read the government's document that makes the point clearly that it is not free money. So if you want to get cute, I would use a different word, but like the Prime Minister, I wish to be kind. I would suggest that the Prime Minister knows full well that what has been done is that the Prime Minister has gotten a loan, but let's park that for a moment. He has incurred a liability with the central bank. The central bank, by going to the market and converting the SDRs into cash, has incurred a liability. And the central bank must pay back, and the government must then pay the central bank. So what the reality is, to make it simple and plain, is that the government of the Bahamas has incurred a debt from member countries of the IMF, a debt that must be repaid. So there's no free money here. The Prime Minister, in being cute, didn't mention one detail about any of those papers he held up. Not one. No details. He just listed them. So we're reading people. The Prime Minister has entered into an arrangement. So again, did not forecast it in the debt management strategy, and never indicated the purpose for which the monies would be used. Imagine that. $178 million, never indicate what the purpose is. And what makes it alarming to us is this is the same administration that was painting the rosy picture that all is well, that the economy blinging, it running, it clicking on all cylinders. We are ahead of revenue projections, things Gucci, things going well. But yet, we are drawing down on these reserves that are a part of the assets of the central bank. So, Madam Speaker, for all of the bluster of the Prime Minister, the reality is his own document. Let me read it for members of the public. It says, Memorandum of Understanding between the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank of the Bahamas regarding the respective responsibilities, listen to this, respective responsibilities of the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank of the Bahamas in connection with the use of the 2021 special drawing rights allocation by the International Monetary Fund. This is the document. And if you go in this document, Madam Speaker, on page 2, look at item F to the bottom of page 2. Here's what it says. Based on the advice of its external legal counsel, the bank is of the view that, one, using the 2021 SDR allocation for the purpose would create a liability from the government to the bank, notwithstanding Section 4(6) of the Act. And two, a position could be taken, as it has been, that the government would have exceeded the authorized borrowing limit set forth in Section 21 of the Central Bank of the Bahamas Act 2020, the Central Bank Act. The reality is the legal counsel had a concern and expressed it. In fact, we believe that the central bank officials were reluctant to enter into this agreement, because you would recall that they are on record having said previously to the Minis administration that you could not use these allocations for whatever the purpose is that the government is now using for. We don't know. The government refuses to tell us. And the Minnis administration paid attention to the short-term lending time that was required, 91 days. This government has a loan, or they said it's not a loan. They have a liability that is for a year. So not only do they exceed the ceiling, they exceed the timeline consistent with the use of SDRs. I'm sure the Prime Minister knows better. Let me continue. In the same document, Article 3, servicing of the obligations to the IMF. Yeah, this servicing, any of you have had loans? Plenty struggling Bahamians had loans. We know we have to service the loans. But the Prime Minister says that this is free money. Servicing of the obligation to the IMF that relate to the use of the 2021 SDR allocation shall be fulfilled without a financial burden to the bank. Payments of all costs and charges related to the use and reconstitution of the SDR allocation, including payment of interest charges as determined by the IMF, are the responsibility of the ministry. 2, the interest rate payments to the IMF will be made by the bank on behalf of the government in accordance with the procedures of the IMF. 3, the bank and the ministry will agree the schedule for the government's 1, payment of the cost, charges, and interest rates for its use of the SDR allocation. That sounds like free money. Reconstitution of the SDR allocation. That sounds like free money. And B, the schedule for reconstitution shall be no later than the maturity schedule for the government's US dollar liabilities. If this was free money, they'd get a piece of paper and say that one over. Didn't happen. All the signatures on the back. Signatures include the Prime Minister and the Governor of the Central Bank. Madam Speaker, it gets worse. It gets worse. Madam Speaker, this government drew down on the money in 2 tranches and did so again before the law permitted them to do so. Imagine that. You know how many young Bahamians, middle-aged and older Bahamians are before the courts being accused of moving things that they had no lawful right for. You may have a need, but obviously this government even denied that it had a need. But people are before the courts. But this administration refused, Madam Speaker, to do what it could have. The government could have simply come here, amended the law, and then proceed with their folly, with what they intended to do. But instead, because this administration is not transparent, no respect for law, they are prepared to make these bold decisions, as they did in taking a loan in the Department of Housing, in the Ministry of Housing, claiming to be a corporate soul, knowing full well the Housing Act does not give them the authority to do so. In the same way, they went to the Treasury and took funds to go to Bermuda and then say, man, that's like zero because we can pay it back. How many people are locked down in Fox Hill for no? I mean, it's just absolutely incredible because they moved something. They didn't have the luxury. They didn't have the protection of Parliament and executive privilege to say we can take care of that later. This government is prepared to break the law and then come here with bluster and insults because we simply raise a question which is our duty. Madam Speaker, so calculating are the actions of this administration that you would recall, Madam Speaker, that we just amended the Public Financial Management Act. And we kept raising the question. The member for East Grand Baham and myself stayed on this issue. Why did you amend the previous act to remove Section 5.4 that reads, a public officer or public office holder shall not expend public money, create debt, enter into any commitments or otherwise create liabilities for the government without lawful authority. Do you think for a moment, Madam Speaker, they anticipated that if that was to remain in the bill they were about to pass, that there could be some culpability, some responsibility for those that violated the Central Bank Act, and that maybe they wanted to hold off until they have come to do this thing, to retroactively fix an illegal act that they carried out? Because that's what they're doing. But we will not be complicit with that. You can't break the law, come here. You can't be, to borrow a phrase, you can't be strong and wrong simultaneously, as Bahamians say at the same time. It's inappropriate. So, Madam Speaker, we are deeply concerned that there's one law for the Progressive Liberal Party, the Davis-led administration, and then there's a different law for the rest of Bahamians. Madam Speaker, if you look at the Central Bank Act, it says some very interesting things. I want to go for a moment, Madam Speaker, to page 16 of the Act. Advances to the government. It reads, 21(1). Subject to the provisions of this section, the bank shall not make any direct or indirect advances to the government or to any public corporation. Now, if you hold in some money for somebody, whenever you're ready to get your money, that's your things. You call them, and they free up. They make available, the funds to you. Contrary to the claims of the member for Cat Island, this was not free money just parked there that whenever he or his colleagues decide, they could go and get it. If that was the case, everything I just read would not have been necessary. And so, again, the Minister administration complied with that provision. This administration, not a day like it. They're above the law. Everybody else will be beaten over their head with the law, but not this administration. Madam Speaker, let me go back to the guidance notes just for a moment. Madam Speaker, guidance notes, the Prime Minister pulled frequently asked questions. So obviously, when he pressed that button, he didn't have time to read all the other stuff. He just focused on the frequently asked questions. We do that from time to time. But there's a broader, thicker document that has more information. And point 5 in that document says the following. I'm just going to read 2 sentences into your hearing today, Pastor. 5 says, at the same time, the SDR allocation entails risk that need to be considered and managed. Recipient countries could delay needed macroeconomic adjustment and reforms or use SDRs without fully considering the potential costs and risk. Second sentence, these include, among others, the quarterly interest charges at variable interest rates associated with the use of SDRs and the need to monitor closely SDR holdings to ensure timely settlement of SDR-denominated obligations to the fund. Obligations. Free money, well, in this case, this makes it very clear. The government has taken on a liability by taking possession of what was a part of the central bank's asset. And when the central bank, in agreement with the government, went to the international market to convert those SDRs to cash, they incurred a liability, which they must repay. But the cost ain't going to stay with them. It's going to go to the borrower, the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. It is a liability. Take the word loan, throw it out of the window if you like. But it is a liability that this administration, and by extension us as a people, have to fulfill. And the question is, in having to pay this back in a year, if you couldn't pay, if you didn't have the money last year, what is occurring in the economy that's going to empower you within the 12-month period to pay now? We suspect that it's going to be rolled over as frequently as the Prime Minister is able to get assistance in executing that. And so, Madam Speaker, I wish to read another part of the guidance notes into your hearing. Number 27, a member's decision on the on-lending, that is, from you to another, arrangements should be informed by financial autonomy considerations for central bank. Again, there's a degree of independence that the central bank has, right? These include whether the on-lending balances fall in the statutory limits or prohibitions or credit to government. And I talked about that earlier. That while the SDRs are made available to member countries, the SDRs, the use of them, the accessing of them, it's all subjected to the laws of the country. And that's why the member for East Grand Bahama constantly talked about the Debt Management Act. And so at the 27.1,
The actual guidance notes.
they're not the frequently asked questions. The second part of number 27 says, the accounting consequences that follow from the terms and conditions of such on-lending based on central bank's financial reporting framework. That's okay. But I tell you, Madam Speaker, why is this important? This is important, Madam Speaker, because investors who are listening to our Prime Minister, rating agencies who are listening to our Prime Minister, the credit market that's listening to the Prime Minister, they must be concerned today that the Prime Minister's representation of these facts are inaccurate, and he is at the helm. He is at the helm. He is responsible. And so, Madam Speaker, when your members say nobody understands, the people who can impact our economy clearly understand that the facts have been misrepresented by the member for Cat Island, Rum Key, and San Salvador, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, as I wrap up, Madam Speaker, I go back to the original document. What the Prime Minister has said today on his feet is what he has said in the letter that he wrote to me, what he has said in the public domain, Madam Speaker. It is nothing short of misleading the public. Even if he doesn't want to use a word loan, that's fine. It is a liability that he has incurred. Why did he not, in his earlier contribution to the debt management bill, why did he not tell us that he was going to take possession of this funds? The only time this government addressed the $232.8 million in special drawing rights is when we raised it. Before that, it was of no moment. Before that, they didn't get in a discussion in the public domain about having to come here today to clean up what they did back then. Let's just think about it. Even though you're on side, just think about this for a moment. Why is there a necessity for it to be retroactive if nothing wrong was done? It is to correct the misappropriation of funds. But they are not strangers. They are not strangers to that, Madam Speaker. They did it in going to Bermuda. No consequences. Everybody else has to face consequences, but not this crew. Worse. Madam Speaker, let me just highlight as I take my seat the pattern of behavior, because this is not a one-off. There's a pattern of behavior by this administration. During both the 22nd of February debate on the fiscal responsibility report and the midterm budget, we asserted that this government had a liability, and they denied all the way through, much like the member for Fort Charlotte did with BPL. In one clip, we have 10 minutes and 11 seconds. He told an untruth 8 times. I mean, just most unfortunate. And then only admitted later. And then implicated the member for Cat Island, Rum Key, and San Salvador. In other words, we did this together, you know. But by the way, he made the decision. It was him, you know. The member ran from that. The member said, no, it wasn't me. It was he said the ministry. The tape said, he said the minister. But here was the takeaway from the midterm budget. this administration, violation of the Procurement Act, their position is simply, we can change the law. So us violating it all the way through is irrelevant because at one day, at some point in the future, we can change it. That's what this is. We will take the money, and later on, we can come back to make the legislation say that everything was fine in terms of what we did. That's what we're doing here. Read the amendment. They violated the procurement law, the Procurement Act. They violated the Central Bank Act. They violated the Debt Management Act, violated the Housing Act. That's why the member left. They violated Road Traffic Act, Madam Speaker, and they violated the Public Financial Management Act. So, Madam Speaker, as I take my seat, I just ask for just a minute or two, Madam Speaker, to just make the point that this is a country of laws. And this administration should behave in a consistent manner as opposed to projecting the image that they are the paragon of virtue. And yet, we bring clear evidence that they are consistently violating the laws of the Bahamas and have no remorse, no shame, and I fear no intention to change in the future. Marco City, and by extension, members of our team do not support this amendment.